One woman thought she was helping a neighbor, but what she uncovered inside that house would change her life forever. It was a discovery so terrifying, she may never escape it. What happened next will haunt her, and you for a lifetime. Stay tuned, because you won't believe the shocking twist at the end. Don't skip ahead. This is a story you have to see through to the end. She stepped lightly across the creaky floorboards of a hallway. The house felt unusually still, almost suffocating. Her breath echoed in the silence. The faint smell of dust lingered in the air, clinging to everything. It was the first time she had visited her neighbor's home since they'd moved in months ago. A soft knock had gone unanswered earlier, and she was growing curious. Maybe the neighbor had left. But the door had been slightly ajar when she passed by. She hesitated. Her hand reached out. The cool metal of the doorknob was like ice against her skin. A faint click echoed as it turned. Inside, the living room was dark. Shadows stretched across the walls like elongated fingers. The windows were closed, but there was an odd draft that made the room feel cold. Her footsteps seemed louder than before, each one echoing unnervingly in the empty space. She crossed to the hallway, her eyes darting from one corner to the next. Every piece of furniture looked out of place, slightly turned, as if something had disturbed it. A chill ran down her spine. The hallway felt endless, though it was only a few steps to the back door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. But something stopped her. A strange sound. A soft, shuffling noise came from behind the closed door at the end of the hall. It wasn't a footstep. It was something else, like something scraping along the floor. Her heart pounded. She took a step closer. The air grew heavier. The smell of dust was now mixed with something else. Something sharp. Her throat tightened. With every step she took, the noise grew louder. Closer. Was it the wind?
No.
It was deliberate. A low groan, like something moving across the floor. Her hand hesitated over the doorknob again. She could feel the pulse in her fingers. Should she open it? Was anyone there? The door creaked. She pushed it gently. A crack of light escaped into the dark room beyond. Her breath caught in her throat. There, in the corner of the room, something shifted. A figure. It didn't look like a person. It was too still. Too unnatural. Her eyes locked onto it. A figure hunched low on the floor. Something not quite human. Then it moved. It turned its head. The hollow eyes locked onto hers. Frozen. She couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in on her. She stepped back, but the door slammed shut behind her. Her heart thundered in her chest. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the crack under the door. There was something on the other side. Something waiting. She backed away, her pulse racing. Her legs felt like jelly, unsteady under her weight. The air around her thickened, heavy with dread. The silence now felt oppressive. Her breath was sharp, each inhale too loud in her ears. She pressed her back against the wall, eyes still locked on the door. The sound of scraping returned.
It was closer now.
Almost as if it were moving toward her. Her fingers gripped the edges of the wall, nails digging into the cold plaster. She didn't dare to look away. The floor creaked behind her, faint but unmistakable. Something was coming. Closer. The room, the house, the very walls seemed to be closing in. The air smelled heavier, almost sour. A whisper of something unnatural filled the space. The scraping sound stopped abruptly. Silence. Deafening silence. Her heart was the only sound in her ears now, pounding like a drum. The world outside the house felt so far away, distant and unreachable. She couldn't think. Her mind raced, tangled in a web of confusion and terror. Then, the door creaked open again. Slowly.
Too slowly.
Her breath caught in her throat. The figure from before was gone. But something else stood in the doorway now. It wasn't human. A shadow, tall and unnatural. Its outline was impossible to make out, the darkness swallowing it whole. It moved, but there was no sound. Just a feeling of cold, a presence in the air. Her skin crawled. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But her feet felt glued to the floor. A sudden movement. A flash of motion. The thing lunged. Her scream was trapped in her throat, her mouth dry. It was so fast. Too fast. It was in front of her, just inches away. The temperature dropped even further. Her body froze, terror paralyzing her. The figure leaned in close, its form hazy and twisted. She could feel its breath, cold and heavy on her skin. The faintest whisper of a voice. A name. Her name. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud. She stood alone in the hallway, gasping for air. Her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor, shaking. Her mind couldn't process what had just happened. What was that thing? Why was it calling her name? The silence stretched on, but it felt wrong, unnatural. Something was still there, watching. The air felt thick, suffocating. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to steady her breathing. Her heart beat wildly in her chest, her hands trembling uncontrollably. It wasn't just fear now. It was something else, something primal. Her eyes darted to the walls, the shadows dancing like living things. Every corner seemed to hide a secret. Every whisper of air felt like a touch against her skin. She wanted to run, but the house, it felt alive. The floorboards creaked again.
Slowly.
Deliberately. Footsteps. Her head whipped around, but she saw nothing. The hallway was empty. The door to the room was still closed. She strained her ears. The footsteps stopped. Then a faint tapping began, like fingers drumming on wood. It was coming from the back of the house. Her eyes shot toward the dark hallway leading to the kitchen. The sound grew louder, closer. She couldn't stay. She pushed herself off the floor, legs shaking beneath her. Her hand reached for the door, the cold metal sending a shock through her body. But just as she touched it, a sound stopped her dead in her tracks. A low, guttural growl. The sound came from behind her, from deep within the shadows. Her breath caught. A chill spread through her chest, freezing her in place. The growl was followed by a scraping noise. Something shifting, something moving. Her eyes widened as she turned slowly, dread seizing her heart. There, in the corner of the room, the figure was back. Only it wasn't just standing anymore. It was crawling toward her. Slowly. Methodically. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, twitching as it moved closer. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers. A slithering sound followed its every movement, like something wet and slippery dragging across the floor. Her hands gripped the doorknob, knuckles white with fear. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The thing was closer now, its grotesque shape a blur of twisted limbs and blackened skin. A scent, sharp and putrid, filled the room. It was so close. Too close. The growl turned into a low, rasping hiss. And then it spoke. A voice that wasn't quite a voice, but a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all around her. "Don't leave." Her stomach twisted, ball rising in her throat. That wasn't her neighbor's voice. It wasn't human at all. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. Before she could react, it lunged. She stumbled back, falling to the floor in a heap of terror. Her body screamed to run, but her legs were frozen, useless. The thing was upon her, its weight crushing, its breath hot and rancid. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Her hand grasped at the floor, fingers digging into the wood as she tried to push herself away. But it was too late. The thing was right there. Its eyes, hollow and endless, stared into her soul. And for the first time, she understood. It wasn't just her neighbor's house that was haunted. It was something far worse. And it wasn't ready to let her go. The air thickened around her, suffocating her with a weight she couldn't escape. Her chest constricted as the thing's cold, clawed hands pressed against her skin. She gasped for air, her vision swimming. It whispered again, its voice like nails scraping against stone. Stay. Her body was frozen, each movement feeling as if it were trapped in thick mud. The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in as its presence surrounded her. She could feel its breath on her face. Icy, rancid. Her heart hammered in her ears. Every instinct told her to run, but her body wouldn't respond. The thing's eyes were unblinking, staring into hers, as if it could see every fear, every doubt she'd ever had. It was almost like it was feeding off her terror. The floor beneath her seemed to quiver. She tried to push away, but her hands were weak. Her legs didn't move. The coldness of the room seeped into her bones. She felt trapped, cornered in a place that no longer resembled the home she had walked into just moments ago. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, to stretch, reaching out as if to drag her into the dark. A sudden noise broke the suffocating silence, a loud bang from upstairs. She jolted, her eyes darting toward the sound. For a moment, the figure stopped, its grip loosening just slightly. She used that brief moment to push herself up, summoning every ounce of strength to break free. The thing snarled, but she didn't stop. She scrambled to her feet, barely able to steady herself. Her heart raced as her feet stumbled, desperate for escape. The door was within reach.
Just a few more steps.
But she could feel it, hear it, right behind her. A dark, twisted presence pressing against her, as if it were right there, at her back. She yanked the door open, the sudden light blinding her. Without a second thought, she bolted into the hallway. Her footsteps echoed against the walls as she ran, panic consuming her every thought. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She didn't know what she was running from anymore, but every part of her screamed that it was too late. The sound of heavy footsteps followed her, a dreadful rhythm that matched her pulse. She ran past the stairs, past the kitchen, and straight for the front door. It felt so far away. The door handle was slick with her sweat, but she didn't care. Her fingers fumbled, frantic, until she finally wrenched it open. The cold night air hit her like a slap. She didn't hesitate. She ran into the street, her legs carrying her further and further away. But in the back of her mind, the question lingered. Was it truly over? Had she escaped? Or was it simply biding its time, waiting for her to make the wrong move? The shadows of the house stretched long in the distance, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw someone, watching from the window. Her breath hitched.
No.
She couldn't look back now. She wouldn't. Her feet pounded against the pavement, the cold night air biting at her skin. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. She didn't dare slow down. The streetlights blurred as she raced down the road, the familiar suburban neighborhood stretching out before her. But there was no comfort in it. No safety. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following her, lurking in the shadows. She glanced behind her, only for a moment, but saw nothing. Just empty streets. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her legs felt like they might give out any second. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind of images. The thing's eyes. The growl. Its voice whispering her name. It was like the sound had followed her, ringing in her ears, too clear to ignore. She felt her stomach twist with the memory, bile rising in her throat. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until she was sure. As she ran, she passed familiar houses, each one now feeling like a trap. Each one was a reminder that her home was still too far away. She pushed on, her feet aching, her mind spinning with every turn, every shadow. Then, as she rounded a corner, she froze. The street was empty, but there, at the end of the block, she saw it. The house. Her neighbor's house. The one she had just fled. It stood there in the distance, silent and still, its dark windows staring back at her. A chill ran down her spine.
She should be far from it by now.
She had run, hadn't she? But the house was still there, as if it had followed her, as if it had always been waiting.
No.
No, she couldn't be imagining this. She turned, ready to keep running, but something caught her eye. A figure, standing in the yard. It was too far to make out clearly, but she could feel its gaze. A sickening, icy sensation flooded her veins. She couldn't breathe. It was there. The thing from the house. It was standing in the open, just beyond the streetlight, watching her. The thing that had been hunting her. She backed away, her feet stumbling over the pavement. She needed to keep moving, but her body was paralyzed. Her breath caught in her throat. It was too far to make out, but she could feel it. The darkness seemed to pull at the edges of her vision, like a fog creeping in, smothering the world around her. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, in a split second, she saw it. Its eyes. The same hollow, empty eyes. The same twisted shape. It was too real. Too close. She turned on her heel and ran, not caring any more about the pain, the fear, or the terror gnawing at her insides. All that mattered was distance. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. As her legs carried her farther and farther away, she realized one terrible thing. The thing from her neighbor's house hadn't been following her. It had never left. Her legs burned with the effort, but she couldn't stop. Every step felt like it was taking her deeper into a nightmare, and yet she couldn't outrun the suffocating terror wrapping itself around her. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight, but the world around her seemed to close in. She was so focused on the path ahead, she didn't see the shadows stretching across the road until it was too late. Something moved in the corner of her eye. A flicker of movement, just ahead. She froze, her body screaming to run but unable to move. The figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, blocking her path. Not a person. Not human. Its form was distorted, like a nightmare made flesh, its twisted limbs hanging at unnatural angles. It was as though it had been waiting for her. Her heartbeat hammered in her ears, drowning out all other sounds. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. She couldn't breathe. Her pulse surged, and her legs trembled beneath her. She couldn't escape. It took a step forward. She stumbled back, her hands reaching out, her body shaking uncontrollably. The figure was closer now, moving with an unnatural speed that defied logic. It was impossibly fast. It was so close. Its cold, clawed hand reached out toward her. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, but it was swallowed by the night. The world spun around her as she felt the grip close around her arm, sharp and freezing. Her body went limp, as if all the strength had drained from her in an instant. The thing pulled her toward it, its presence suffocating, its breath colder than ice. She tried to fight, but her limbs were too weak, her mind too fogged with panic. And then, in a low whisper that sent shivers down her spine, it spoke again. "Stay with me." The voice was hers, yet not. It was twisted, distorted, like something was feeding off her very essence. A cold wave of dread washed over her, and she realized with sudden clarity. It wasn't trying to take her anywhere. It was already inside her. Her heart raced, but the grip on her arm tightened. She was being pulled, not into the street, but into the dark, the shadows that surrounded her. The darkness she had been running from. She couldn't escape. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was the thing's face, those eyes, and the twisted, hungry smile curling at the corners of its lips. It wasn't over. It had never been over. The darkness swallowed her whole. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she couldn't tell if she was still running or if she had stopped altogether. The coldness gripped her like a vice, as though it were pulling her into something far worse than the void. She tried to scream, but her mouth felt numb, her body frozen in place. Her thoughts scattered like shattered glass, every sense dulled under the weight of an unseen force. It wasn't just the thing anymore. It was everything. The darkness around her seemed alive, shifting and breathing, closing in from all sides. Her skin tingled with the sensation of being watched, but there was nowhere to turn. The cold penetrated deeper, burrowing into her bones, seeping into her very soul. She was no longer in the street. She was somewhere else. Somewhere far darker, far colder. A low hum echoed in the distance, a sound that vibrated through her body. And then she saw it again. The thing. It stood before her, its shape twisting in the dim light, a silhouette of nightmare. Its hollow eyes pierced through her, as though it could see into the very core of her being. It moved closer, its presence suffocating, overwhelming her senses. Her body felt paralyzed, like her soul was caught in a vice. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. It reached out for her, its fingers curling like claws, each one longer and more grotesque than the last. And then, with a sudden, violent motion, it grabbed her by the throat. She gasped, the air caught in her lungs as its icy grip tightened around her. She couldn't scream. She couldn't fight. The thing leaned in close, its breath rancid and cold. It whispered again, its voice a mocking, distorted version of her own. "Stay with me." The words sank deep, twisting in her mind. And as its grip tightened, she realized with a shuddering certainty, this wasn't just a house. It wasn't just a thing. It was a trap. A trap that had been set long before she even knew. She was never meant to leave. The darkness consumed her completely. There was no escape now. Her body went limp in its hold, and the last shred of her consciousness was swallowed by the void. And in that silence, in that endless darkness, she understood. She would never be free. Not from the house. Not from the thing. And certainly not from the thing inside her now. The darkness pressed in on her, suffocating every thought, every flicker of resistance. It wasn't just blackness. It was alive, a swirling void that seemed to reach into every corner of her mind, pulling everything away. Her memories, her thoughts, her identity, all of it was being erased. She couldn't hold on to anything. Her eyes fluttered open, but all she could see was the dark and endless, shifting blackness that pressed against her. She felt weightless, as though she were floating in the center of an abyss. There was no sound, no light, nothing except the oppressive presence that surrounded her. And then, slowly, something began to shift in the dark. A movement. It was subtle, at first, just a ripple in the void. But then it grew, expanding and contracting like something breathing. She didn't understand. Was it the thing? Was it still there? The coldness, the suffocating grip. It hadn't left. It had been waiting, watching, feeding on her fear. And now it was inside her. She felt it, its presence inside her chest, its influence creeping into every part of her being. Her heart raced, pounding in her ears. But it wasn't her heart. It was the thing's heart. The coldness, the darkness. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was her. She could feel it, the twisted essence of it, coursing through her. Her hands, were they even her own anymore? She reached out, feeling the void around her, but there was nothing, no ground, no walls to steady her. Just the cold, endless blackness. And then a voice. But not hers. Not hers at all. The voice was distorted, familiar yet unrecognizable, like the thing had woven itself into her thoughts, into her very soul. "You're mine now," it whispered, its tone low and cruel. Her body jerked, as if reacting to the words. It was the thing, the same creature, the same force. It had her. It had taken her. And it was making her part of itself. Her body trembled uncontrollably as the force of its presence filled her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but it wasn't her breath. It was the thing's, dragging her deeper into itself. The void seemed to stretch, expanding and pulling at her in every direction. Her thoughts became hazy, drifting away like leaves in a storm. She tried to scream, to fight, but her body wasn't her own anymore. The thing had consumed her, body and mind. And as she felt herself slipping away completely, the final understanding took hold. She had never been just a visitor. She had never been just a neighbor. She had been a part of it from the very beginning. A pawn in its endless hunger. A piece in its eternal game. And now, there was nothing left of her. Nothing but the cold darkness. And the thing that would never let her go. The darkness wrapped around her, consuming every trace of who she once was. Her body, her thoughts, her very essence. All of it was fading, being swallowed into the abyss. There was no light, no sound, only the hollow, echoing presence of the thing inside her. She felt it everywhere, in every fiber of her being, as if it had woven itself into the very fabric of her soul. It wasn't just that she had been taken. She had become it. The very core of the creature, the hunger, the void, it was now a part of her, as much as her own heartbeat. She could feel it gnawing at her, pulling her deeper, as if the darkness itself was feeding on the remnants of who she had been. Her thoughts were no longer her own. They were twisted, contorted, a reflection of the thing that now inhabited her. Her mind flickered in and out, trapped in a haze of confusion and dread. But deep within that fog, one thought lingered. She was lost. The woman she had been, the person who had walked into that house, was gone. And in her place, there was only the thing. It pulsed within her chest, a cold, rhythmic thud that resonated through every part of her. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but her mouth wouldn't move. Her limbs wouldn't respond. She was trapped, bound to the thing that had taken her. And then, in a sudden rush, a flood of memories hit her all at once. Fragments of her life, her family, her friends, the days before she had walked into that house. They flashed before her eyes, sharp and fleeting, but they felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. A distant echo of a life that was no longer hers. The creature that had claimed her was powerful. It was patient, and it had waited. It had known exactly what to do. She had been nothing more than a vessel, a means to an end. Her mind was no longer her own, but a playground for the thing's twisted desires. It had consumed her thoughts, her memories, until there was nothing left but an empty shell. And as she drifted deeper into the void, the last vestiges of her humanity slipped away completely.
She was part of it now.
A part of the darkness, the hunger, forever lost to the thing that had taken her. And in the silence, in the endless void, she realized there was no escaping. There never had been. She was the thing, and it was her. The void stretched out endlessly, a barren, cold expanse that she could not comprehend. It was vast, infinite, and consuming. Time no longer existed. There was only the coldness, the emptiness, the constant hum of the thing inside her. Her thoughts felt distant, like echoes that were slowly fading, slipping away. She couldn't remember what it was like to be human anymore. To feel warmth, love, fear. It was all gone. Everything that had once defined her had been erased. Her name, her life,
her past.
All of it had been swallowed by the thing, devoured in the dark. Now, all that was left was the hollow rhythm of the heartbeat, its heartbeat. It pulsed, slow and steady, deep within her chest, the beat of something that was not truly alive. She tried to fight it, tried to push against the grip it had on her mind. But the more she struggled, the less she could remember. There was nothing to fight back with. She was already gone. The thing inside her was stronger now. It had learned, adapted, and consumed her completely. Her existence had merged with it, become a part of its dark hunger, its endless need.
There was no trace of her left.
She was lost, buried deep within herself, beneath layers of cold and despair. She couldn't escape. There was no door, no window, no way out. The house, the thing, it had taken everything. And now it was in control. But still, through the haze of the darkness, a flicker of something remained. A memory, a whisper of who she had been. A spark of defiance, buried so deep she could barely feel it.
She didn't want to be this.
She didn't want to become the thing that had taken her. But it was too late. The spark faded, dimming into nothingness as the dark suffocated it. She had given in. There was no escaping the hunger, no escaping the shadows. And in the endless silence of the void, the thing, her, waited. It was patient. It was eternal. And now it was content. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. It was as if the entire world had stopped turning, leaving her in the cold, still dark. She couldn't feel her body anymore. She couldn't feel anything. The nothingness was all-consuming, a weight pressing down on her mind, her soul. She had become a part of the thing, lost to it forever, a shadow in a sea of darkness. There was no escape, no hope, no light. But then something shifted. A faint ripple in the stillness. A faint stir in the cold. For a brief moment, she was aware of something. A faint echo. A flicker of warmth. A thought. It was so small, so fragile, but it felt like a crack in the overwhelming darkness. The tiniest spark of awareness. A memory. A fleeting image of her life before, her family, her home, a time when she was whole. She could see it, just beyond the shadows, like a dream that was almost forgotten. And then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. The thing, her, pulled it back, locked it away, buried it deep. But that flicker remained, haunting her, reminding her of what she had lost.
What she had been.
It was faint, like a heartbeat that barely registered. But it was there. And as she drifted, lost in the blackness, she felt something stirring, an instinct, something primal, a desire to fight, to break free, to reclaim herself. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a shred of defiance inside her, a whisper of her former self, clinging to existence, refusing to die. The thing inside her stirred in response, its grip tightening, but the spark refused to fade. It wasn't over. Not yet. She didn't know how or when, but she knew. There was still something left in her. Something worth fighting for. And even in the darkest corners of the void, she held on to that. She wasn't completely gone. Not yet. The stillness was deafening. But within that silence, something began to shift. The thing inside her stirred, sensing the faint resistance that had started to grow. It was subtle at first, just a whisper in her mind. A spark, a thread of light in the overwhelming darkness. She couldn't remember exactly when it had begun, but she could feel it now, a tiny sliver of her humanity pushing back against the thing that had consumed her. The cold grip of the creature seemed to falter, as if it sensed the fight within her. It tried to tighten, tried to swallow her whole, but she held on to that flicker with all the strength she had left. Her breath was shallow, but she could feel the rise and fall of her chest, the small but significant pulse of life. It was fragile, but it was there. She gathered what little she could, focusing all her thoughts on that spark, that tiny fragment of herself. The darkness, which had once felt suffocating, seemed to stretch a little thinner, as if the light was pushing through it. And then there was a noise. A faint, distant sound. Her name. It was soft at first, like a whisper on the wind, but then it grew louder. The name she had once been. The woman she had once been. And that name, that sound, it cut through the darkness. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something, hope. The thing inside her thrashed, angry, struggling to reclaim its hold, but it was weakening. The grip on her mind loosened, if only for a moment. She clung to that moment, her hands reaching out into the void. She didn't know how long she would have, how long the darkness would fight back. But in that brief second, she was free. Free from the thing. Free from the dark. Her vision blurred, but through the haze, she saw a faint light, growing stronger, pushing away the shadows. It wasn't the end, not yet. But for the first time in so long, she knew she could fight. And maybe, just maybe, she could find her way out.